Let me tell you about the moment I finally understood. We were standing on a narrow balcony on the fourth floor of a guest house in Hoi An, Vietnam, watching the sun come down over the Tu Bon River. The lanterns were just starting to glow along the old town rooftops, hundreds of them, silk and paper in every color you can imagine, and the river was turning this deep orange gold that doesn't look real until you're standing inside it. And my husband Min was next to me, very quiet, and he had this expression on his face I had never seen in 14 years of marriage. Not happiness exactly, something older than happiness. Like relief, maybe. Like a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time had finally, quietly, let it go. And I thought, this is what he's been trying to tell me. For 14 years. This is what he meant. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My name is Saoirse. Yes, it's Irish. Yes, it's pronounced Saoirse. And yes, I have explained that approximately 4,000 times in my life, including, memorably, to Vietnamese customs officials who studied my passport with the particular concentration of people confronting something genuinely baffling. I'm 47 years old. I grew up in Cork, Ireland. I moved to London at 22 to work in healthcare administration, which is where I met Min, who was a junior doctor at the same hospital and who asked me to help him find the cafeteria on his second day and then asked me to dinner on his fourth. I thought that was either very confident or very naive, and it turned out to be neither. He had simply decided, with the particular calm efficiency I would come to recognize as entirely characteristic of him, that I was someone he wanted to know. We married in 2010. We settled in London. We built a life there, a real, cluttered, rooted London life, with a flat in Lewisham and a regular table at a Turkish restaurant on the high street that we'd been going to so long that the owner's son had grown from a child who refilled your water to a teenager who took your order, to a young man who was apparently managing the place on weekends. We had a life, and in that life, Min had what I would describe as a complicated relationship with home. He talked about Vietnam the way you talk about something that matters more than you're entirely comfortable admitting. Not constantly, not dramatically, but in the particular way that certain things surface. A dish he'd eaten somewhere in London that was almost right but not quite, and the slight disappointment when it wasn't. A phone call with his mother that left him quieter for the rest of the evening. A news story about Hanoi, or the Mekong Delta, that he'd read twice when once would have been enough. He'd left Vietnam at 23 on a medical scholarship. He'd been in the UK for nearly a quarter of a century. He was, by every practical measure, built into British life. He had the NHS badge, the pension contributions, the dry sense of humor about the weather that you only develop after a decade of genuine suffering through it. But there was always this layer underneath that I could sense without quite being able to name. I used to ask him sometimes what he missed. He'd always say the food, because that's the safe answer, and it's also always true. But occasionally, when I pushed a little, he'd say something like, "It's hard to explain. It's just, everything there is very alive." And I'd nod, and I'd think I understood, and I didn't. I didn't understand at all. I want to be fair to myself here, because this is a story about a journey, not a confession. I wasn't dismissive of Vietnam. I wasn't uninterested. We'd talked about visiting for years. But life has a way of filling in the space where intention lives. The hospital rotas, the annual leave that went to family in Cork or a long weekend in Portugal, the general busyness of a dual-career household that keeps pushing certain things to next year. Next year became next year became next year. Then Min turned 50. He didn't make a fuss about it. That's not his style. But there was a conversation, about 6 weeks after his birthday, that I remember very precisely. We were in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, the particular London grey of November pressing against the window, and he put down his coffee and said, very quietly, "Saoirse, I want to spend some real time at home. Not a week, real time. I want to go back to Da Nang for at least 3 months, maybe more, and I want you to come with me." I said, 3 months? He said, or longer. I said, "Min, we have jobs." He said, "I know. I've been thinking about this for a while. I think we could make it work. My contract comes up in March. Yours is flexible, and we have leave saved." And then he said the thing that I've thought about many times since. I want you to actually see where I'm from. Not a holiday. Actually see it. Because I don't think you can understand it until you've been inside it for long enough. And I remember thinking, that's a strange thing to say. And also, he's right, and I'm not sure why I know that, but I do. So we went. We arranged a 3-month sabbatical, starting in April, which Min said was the best time because the rains hadn't fully arrived in central Vietnam yet, and the heat, while real, was not yet the thing it would become in July. We packed for a climate I'd never properly inhabited. We booked an apartment in Da Nang, in a neighborhood called My Khe, near the beach, which Min had found through a cousin, and which cost us the equivalent of about £380 a month for a 2-bedroom with a kitchen and a balcony that faced east, toward the water. I had been paying £1,100 for my share of a Lewisham flat with a view of a brick wall and a roof terrace that was technically accessible and practically Arctic from September to April. The arithmetic was, I will admit, striking. We flew via Doha. We landed in Da Nang at 6 in the morning, in that particular quality of early tropical light that is completely different from any light I had ever stood in before, warm and soft, and somehow already full, like the day had been going for hours before you arrived in it. And when the doors of the airport opened and the heat came in, not aggressively, just immediately and entirely, like being wrapped in something, Min stood very still for a moment and breathed. He didn't say anything. He just breathed, and I watched him do it. And something about that, the way his shoulders dropped an inch, the way his face changed in some specific but hard-to-name way, made me understand for the first time that I had agreed to something much larger than a sabbatical. His family met us outside. His mother, Ba Lan, who was 71, and had the kind of posture that suggested a lifetime of quietly refusing to be diminished, and his younger sister, Thuy, who was energetic and warm, and spoke better English than either of them let on initially. I suspected this was a kind of insurance policy. Keep the foreign wife comfortable, deploy the English when needed. Ba Lan took my hands in hers and said something to Min, who translated. She said she was glad I had finally come. She said it simply, without emphasis, the way you say things that are plainly true and need no decoration. I found, to my slight embarrassment, that I had to blink quite hard. We drove into the city in Thuy's car. I watched Da Nang come into view through the window, the Han River, the Dragon Bridge that Min had described to me many times, but which in photographs had seemed slightly too dramatic to be entirely real, and which in person was, in fact, exactly that dramatic and entirely real. The stretch of coastline, the mountains in the distance that Min called the Nut Han Sun, the Marble Mountains, rising from the flat coastal land with an abruptness that looked almost deliberate. I had thought I had a picture of Vietnam in my head. I was beginning to understand that I had a very incomplete rough sketch. The first week was, I want to be precise about this, disorienting in a way that was not unpleasant but was genuinely total. Da Nang is a city of about 1.2 million people, and it moves with the particular pace of somewhere that has been growing fast and confidently and is not especially concerned with accommodating those who haven't kept up. The motorbikes, and there are so many motorbikes, that the sound of them becomes a kind of ambient hum, a city-level white noise you stop noticing after a few days, but which in the first two is almost comic in its density, navigate with a logic I can only describe as emergent. There are lanes, technically. They are treated as starting suggestions. I had been told, by Min and by several travel guides, that the way to cross the road in Vietnam is to walk slowly and steadily and let the traffic flow around you, that stopping suddenly is the error, that consistency is what matters. I understood this intellectually and found it, in practice, completely impossible to trust for the first 4 days. I crossed roads like a woman who had been told to walk calmly through a river of fast-moving water and was managing her terror through sheer stubbornness. Min found this funny in a gentle way. He held my hand every time, which helped more than the advice had. The food was immediate and overwhelming and extraordinary in ways I had not been prepared for, despite having eaten Vietnamese food in London for 14 years and thinking I knew what I was talking about. I did not know what I was talking about. The first bowl of bún bò Huế I had at a small place near the market, a little plastic stool at a table that was barely knee-height, surrounded by locals eating with the efficient focus of people who had better things to do than marvel, was genuinely one of the best things I had ever eaten in my life. I told Min this and he said, very diplomatically, that the version he'd been ordering in London for years had been quite good. The delivery was perfect. I laughed for about 30 seconds. But here is what I want to tell you about those first weeks. The thing that I didn't expect and that nobody had told me, because it's the thing that actually mattered. Watching Min in Vietnam was like watching someone I had known for 14 years suddenly exist in an additional dimension I hadn't been able to see before. At home in London, Min was, and I say this with complete love and no criticism, a certain version of himself. Considered, precise, quietly warm but somewhat contained, the way people who have navigated a foreign country for 25 years often learn to be. That careful professional calibration you develop when you're always operating slightly outside of the culture you grew up in. Here, in Da Nang, with his mother and his sister and the cousin who appeared seemingly from nowhere on day 2 and stayed for most of a week, Min was different. Not dramatically, not in a way that made him unrecognizable, but the calibration was gone. He was faster, somehow, louder in conversation. He'd interrupt and be interrupted, and nobody, including him, seemed to register it as anything other than the ordinary rhythm of talking to people you love. He'd switch between Vietnamese and the occasional English phrase without noticing. He'd be in the kitchen with his mother for an hour before dinner and come out looking like a man who had just been somewhere necessary. I sat watching this across several days and felt something complicated. Happiness for him, genuinely and fully. And also a question I kept turning over. Who was this person, and how had I not known this version existed? Not a crisis, I want to be clear, just a recalibration. The recognition that the man I'd married had a layer of himself he'd kept folded away for a long time, not deliberately, not hidden from me, but simply because the context for it hadn't been available. And now the context was available, and there he was. By the end of week 2, I had started to find my own rhythm, small and tentative but real. I'd found a cafe near our apartment, run by a woman named Hung, who was approximately 60, had strong opinions about coffee, and served a café chung, egg coffee, which sounds alarming and is one of the more extraordinary things I've consumed, that I returned for every other morning. She didn't speak much English, and I spoke almost no Vietnamese, beyond Cam Un, which means thank you, and Xin Chào, which means hello, and a phrase Min had taught me that I was fairly confident meant something reasonably polite. The first time I used it at the market, though, a woman looked at me with such startled warmth that I made a mental note to ask Min exactly what I'd said. He told me later I'd said something close to, "I am grateful for your patience," which is a phrase his mother apparently uses. So that was fine. Embarrassing, but fine. The market was its own education. The Chohan Market in central Da Nang is a covered indoor market that is dense and loud and smells of fish and fruit and something floral I never fully identified, and it is full of people engaged in commerce with the seriousness of those for whom it is both livelihood and social theater. I wandered it with Thuy on our third Thursday there. She showed me the vendors she trusted for vegetables, for fish, for the particular kind of tofu that Ba Lan preferred, and she explained prices, quality indicators, and the specific social protocols of bargaining, which turned out to be more nuanced than I'd assumed. I was firmly instructed not to attempt it myself yet, on the grounds that my face gave away too much information and I would simply lose. This was accurate. I had watched myself in the reflection of a glass display case in the market, attempting to look casual about the price of a mango. My face was doing about 11 things simultaneously. I took the point. It was around week 3 that something shifted in me, not dramatically, but in the way that real shifts happen, quietly, without announcement, so that you only notice when you look back and realize you're standing somewhere different from where you started. I stopped counting the days until we went home. Part of it was Hoi An. We took a day trip there in the 3rd week. It's about 30 kilometers south of Da Nang, less than an hour by car, and I want to try to explain what it's like to see Hoi An for the first time, though Min has told me this is something I will not be able to fully explain to anyone who hasn't stood there, and I'm beginning to think he's right about that too. Hoi An Ancient Town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a trading port that dates back to the 15th century, and it has been preserved with a combination of genuine civic pride and, I suspect, the slightly awestruck paralysis that comes from realizing what you have. The streets are narrow and lined with centuries-old merchant houses, yellow ochre walls, dark timber, tiled roofs, and the Thu Bon River runs along one edge of the old town and is crossed by a Japanese-built covered bridge from 1593 that is small and intricate and somehow completely convincing as an ancient thing, despite having every tourist in the province photographing it simultaneously. But the part that got me, the part that put me on that balcony at sunset, feeling like something inside me had fundamentally rearranged itself, was the lanterns. Hoi An is famous for its lanterns, silk lanterns in every conceivable color that hang from every shopfront and rooftop in the old town, and which at night, especially on the evening of the full moon, when the town holds its monthly lantern festival and the electric lights go off, transform the place into something I genuinely do not have adequate language for. Warm and ancient and entirely human, and beautiful in the specific way of things that have been made carefully by hand for a very long time. We were there on an ordinary evening, not the festival night, just a Tuesday, and it still looked like that. It still looked like the kind of thing you might invent if you were trying to describe a place that justified a 14-year wait. I stood on that balcony next to Min and looked at the river turning gold and said, out loud, not really to him, I never knew Vietnam was so beautiful. He turned and looked at me. I said, I knew, obviously. I knew the facts. I'd seen the photographs. He said, very quietly, but now you're inside it. Yes, now I was inside it. Let me tell you what I learned in the weeks that followed, because this is the part of the story that goes deeper than lanterns and sunsets, which are the easy part, the part that requires no effort to love. The harder and more interesting part was understanding what Min had been carrying, specifically, for 25 years away from home. Because it wasn't simply homesickness in the way I'd understood that word, the pang for familiar food, the ache for family, all of which were real. It was something more structural than that. It was the understanding that he existed differently here, that there was a self he'd been unable to fully inhabit in London, not because London had suppressed it, not because anyone had asked him to be smaller, but simply because this, all of this, the language, the food, the rhythms, the way his mother looked at him, the way his sister argued with him, the way the whole social context he'd grown up in surrounded and recognized him, this was where he was native, where he didn't have to translate himself, even slightly, even unconsciously. That recognition, watching someone experience the relief of not having to translate themselves, changed something in how I understood the previous 14 years. I looked back at things I'd noticed but not quite named, the small effort that was always underneath his ease in London, the way he was never entirely off duty, not because he was unhappy, but because navigating a culture that isn't yours requires a continuous low-level attention that you don't always notice you're spending until you're somewhere that doesn't cost it. Here, in Da Nang, with his family, he wasn't spending that, and the difference was visible, and it was significant, and I loved him for having never complained about it, and I was a little sorry I hadn't understood it sooner. We'd been there 5 weeks when I sat with Ba Lan in the late afternoon while Min was out with his cousin, just the two of us in her sitting room with the electric fan going and cups of the chrysanthemum tea she liked. My Vietnamese was still embarrassingly limited. I had, by this point, mastered enough to greet, thank, and apologize with a reasonable degree of accuracy, which covered more social situations than you might expect. Ba Lan's English was limited, but present in the way of someone who has learned it through effort rather than immersion, careful and precise. We sat in comfortable partial silence for a while. Then she said, choosing her words slowly, "Min is happy here, very happy." She paused. He was also happy in London, I think, but different. Here, he is, she searched for the word, complete. I said, "I can see that." She nodded. She looked at me steadily and said, "You are a good wife. You came. Not everyone comes." I didn't entirely know what to say to that. I said that I was glad I had. She said, "So am I." We stayed the full 3 months. And then, because 3 months had not been enough to make a decision, but had been entirely enough to make clear that a decision needed to be made, we went back to London, had the conversation we'd been quietly approaching for weeks, and started making actual plans. This is where the story gets practical, and I think the practical part matters as much as the beautiful part, because beauty is the reason, but logistics are the vehicle, and you need both. We were not, let me be clear, in a position to simply retire at 47 and 49. Min was 50, I was 47, and we had a mortgage on the Lewisham flat that wasn't finished. We had, however, been doing the maths, and the maths were interesting. The cost of living in Da Nang, for 2 people living comfortably, not luxuriously, but genuinely well, worked out to approximately 1/3 of what our London life cost us. The apartment near Mekong Beach where we'd stayed for 3 months which was genuinely comfortable and had that eastward balcony over the water, had been the equivalent of 380 pounds a month. A similarly sized place in the neighborhood of An Hai Bak, which is quieter and more residential, and where several of Min's extended family lived, was even less, around 280 pounds to 320 pounds. Groceries at the local market, even shopping the way we shopped, came to perhaps a quarter of what we'd been spending at a mid-range London supermarket. Eating out, and in Vietnam, eating out is genuinely more common than cooking at home for many meals, because the food stalls and small restaurants are extraordinary and affordable. A meal for two at a solid local place near us was the equivalent of about £2.50 to £4. Not street food, a proper sit-down meal. Healthcare was the practical question I'd sat with longest. Min had looked into this thoroughly from a medical perspective and had identified the Da Nang Family Hospital and the Vinh Mek International Hospital as the two primary private options in the city, both reputable and significantly less expensive than their London equivalents, with Vinh Mek being particularly well regarded for expats and international patients. Comprehensive private health insurance in Vietnam for two people in their late 40s came to roughly £1,400 a year. Compare that to the national insurance contributions, plus the increasing frustration of NHS waiting times, and the arithmetic was doing something interesting again. We rented out the Lewisham flat. That decision alone covered a significant portion of our remaining needs. Min arranged a remote consulting arrangement with his hospital, not full-time, but enough to maintain income and professional connection during a transition period. I found that my healthcare administration background translated surprisingly well to remote contract work, and within 2 months of returning to Da Nang, which we did in October, permanently this time, or as permanently as a 50-year-old doctor and a 47-year-old Irish woman can commit to anything, I had 2 clients I was working with on a part-time basis that between them gave us stable additional income requiring about 20 hours a week of my attention. We were not rich, but we were doing something that London had made feel impossible for years. We were living within our means, and actually ahead of them, in a place that was beautiful, warm, full of extraordinary food, and where the man I'd married 14 years ago was, and I keep coming back to this word because it's the accurate one, complete. I want to tell you about the 6 months after we moved, because they were not uniformly transcendent, and I think it's important to be honest about that. The language was the persistent hard thing. Vietnamese is tonal. It has 6 tones, and a single syllable can mean 6 completely different things depending on how you pitch it, which means the margin for accidental absurdity is very wide, and I filled it regularly. There was an incident at the market involving what I believed was a confident request for 2 kilograms of tomatoes, and what turned out to be something I am still not entirely certain of because the vendor's expression was too complicated to read. When I told Min about it later, he laughed for slightly too long before explaining. I have decided not to pursue the full translation. My Vietnamese improved slowly but measurably. By month 4, I could manage basic market negotiations, with some dignity, Thuy confirmed, and by month 6, I could follow perhaps 60% of a family dinner conversation, which meant I laughed at the right moments, often enough that it stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like participation. Ba Lan had taken it upon herself to teach me 5 new words each morning when I came for tea. She kept a small notebook. She checked my pronunciation with the patient rigor of a woman who understood that correct tone was not optional and was not going to lower her standards because I was Irish. I adored her for this. There were also the bureaucratic realities, which Min had researched thoroughly, and which I will not pretend were simple. As a foreign national married to a Vietnamese citizen, My visa situation involved a specific process, a long-term temporary resident card, called a thẻ tạm trú, tied to Minh status, renewable, requiring documentation that Vietnam's government offices process with an efficiency that varies considerably depending on the day, the official, and, it sometimes seemed, the phase of the moon. We found a good visa agent, a woman named Lynn, who had been navigating this paperwork for expats for 12 years, who charged a reasonable fee and had the calm confidence of someone who had seen every bureaucratic variation and was not alarmed by any of them. I recommend finding a Lynn wherever you go. The heat, in summer, was genuinely formidable. Da Nang in July sits at around 34 or 35 degrees, with humidity that makes it feel closer to 39. I developed strong opinions about the timing of outdoor activities, before 9 in the morning and after 5 in the evening, and not at all between 11 and 3 unless absolutely necessary. This is not actually a hardship once you've restructured your day around it. The Vietnamese have been doing this for generations, which is why the cities come alive again in the early evening in a way that Cork in July never quite manages, and why dinner doesn't really start until 7 or 8, and the streets are still full at 10. There were days when I felt the full weight of being foreign. When something went wrong that I couldn't navigate alone, a problem with a utility bill, a misunderstanding with a delivery, once an incomprehensible letter from a government office that turned out to be entirely routine, but which I stared at for 20 minutes in a state of mild panic because I couldn't parse it, and I was reminded that the ease of daily life is built on language and context, and I had enough of neither, yet, to take it for granted. I want to name that honestly, because I think the accounts of expat life that don't name it are doing a disservice to the people who read them. There is a tax on being foreign. It is not prohibitive, and it decreases over time, but it is real, and it shows up in the small ways, the daily, small ways, the moments when you reach for a competence that you have in your native context and find that it hasn't fully transferred yet. But then there were the other moments. There was the morning in month 3 when I walked to Hung's cafe and she had my café chung on the counter before I'd even sat down, without being asked. She said something in Vietnamese that I didn't entirely catch, but Minh told me later it roughly meant, "There's the regular." And I sat there in the early warmth with my egg coffee and my book, and felt, for the first time since we'd arrived for good, that I was not a visitor here. There was the evening of Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, which we spent with Minh's family in a way I cannot adequately describe, except to say that it made every Christmas of my childhood seem slightly underproduced. The preparation alone takes days. The bánh chung, which are sticky rice cakes wrapped in banana leaves and cooked for hours. The dried candied fruits and seeds arranged in circular trays. The branches of peach blossom and yellow mai flowers that appear in every home and business and make the whole city look briefly like something out of a very specific, beautiful dream. The reunion dinner on New Year's Eve was at Ba Lan's house. 12 people around a table, plates arriving continuously, everyone talking at once. Minh translating with increasing approximation as the evening went on and the conversation accelerated. Ba Lan made a point of placing me next to her. She explained the dishes as they arrived, carefully, in her deliberate English, making sure I understood what I was eating and why it mattered. "This is bông bì, gourd flower soup," she said. "This is for clear thinking in the new year. This is thịt dong, jellied pork, a northern dish. She makes it in memory of her mother who was from Hanoi. This is jo lua, Vietnamese pork sausage. You must have this at Tet. There is no Tet without it." She watched me eat with the focused attention of someone for whom feeding people is a primary form of love. And somewhere between the gourd flour soup and the jellied pork, I stopped being a guest at someone else's celebration and simply started being there. That was the moment, if I had to name one. Though the honest answer is that it wasn't one moment. It never is. It's been 14 months now since we moved for good. I want to tell you what our life actually looks like, the ordinary shape of it, because I think the ordinary is what people actually need to know. We live in An Hai Bak, in a house, not a flat, a proper house with a small courtyard and a roof terrace, that we rent for the equivalent of £310 a month. This still produces a small disbelief when I say it out loud to friends in London. £310 for a house with a courtyard. Min has breakfast every morning at a pho stall 3 minutes walk away where he's now recognized, and where the woman who runs it, a small, determined woman everyone calls Ko Hua, saves him a particular cut of beef because she's decided he has good taste. This costs him about 60 pence. I walk to Hung's Cafe most mornings. On Tuesdays and Fridays, I go to the Cha Han market, where I now have my vendors. I say this with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who took a while to get there. The woman for vegetables who overestimates how much I can eat by about 30% every single time, and whom I've stopped arguing with because she's usually right. And the fish stall run by two brothers who once spent 10 minutes teaching me the Vietnamese names for 7 different types of fish, of which I've retained about 3. Min consults remotely 2 days a week and has, in the past 6 months, begun exploring what a role might look like within the Vietnamese health system. There are conversations happening about a part-time clinical education position at a medical college in Da Nang that would suit him well, and that, I can see, excites him in a way that 30 years in NHS hospitals never quite managed. I work my contract hours in the mornings, usually finished by noon, and have the afternoons for whatever I like, which is sometimes the beach, 12 minutes from our front door, and sometimes working on my Vietnamese with varying degrees of success, and sometimes simply sitting on the roof terrace with a book in the kind of weather that Cork manages approximately 4 days a year and Da Nang delivers for most of 8 months. My sister visited in June. She arrived at Da Nang Airport with the expression of someone who had agreed to come mainly out of curiosity and wasn't entirely certain she'd made the right call, and who by day 3 was asking Min what the actual process was for looking into longer-term stays. She didn't mean it seriously, but she meant it more than she'd expected to. On her last evening, we sat on the roof terrace, watching the light change over the city, Min and my sister talking about something I was only half following, and she turned to me at some point and said, "Saoirse, why didn't you tell me it was like this?" And I said, "I did." And she said, "No, you described it, you sent photographs. That's not the same as this." And I thought of what Min had said to me in our kitchen in Lewisham on that gray November morning. I want you to actually see it, because I don't think you can understand it until you've been inside it for long enough. He had been right. He had been patient and right, the way he usually is about the things that matter. I didn't understand why Min missed home until I stood inside it, until I watched him be complete here in a way that London, with all its genuine gifts, had never quite allowed. Until I learned 6 tones of a language I can still only partially speak, and burned a pot of Kang Chua soup under Ba Lan's precise and unsympathetic instruction, and crossed a roundabout in Da Nang traffic with my heart hammering and my pace steady, and sat in Hung's Cafe in the warm early morning with an egg coffee that no version of London would ever give me, and felt, genuinely, actually felt, that I was not a visitor here anymore. Some places take time to understand. Some people carry a home inside them for 25 years, waiting patiently for you to come and see why. Some marriages teach you things in the 14th year that the first 13 only prepared you for. I came to Vietnam to understand my husband. I stayed because I understood myself a little better too. And that, honestly, was the part I didn't see coming.